Richard Sterling believed the foundation of his house was made of stone and history, a legacy carved into the very earth beneath the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Estates. He was a man who spoke of bloodlines and acquisitions in the same breath, convinced they were one and the same. He didn't know the foundation was actually made of paper, of defaulted loans and desperate leveraging, and that the quiet, unassuming man sitting at his dinner table now held the pen that had signed it all away. That man, his son-in-law Leo, endured the casual cruelty of the evening with a patience that the Sterlings mistook for weakness. They thought this dinner was a judgment. They didn't know it was a final exam, and they had already failed. Within 3 hours, the grand Sterling estate, this monument to their perceived superiority, would become nothing more than a roof over their heads, granted by the very man they were trying to crush beneath their heel. This is a story about the quiet strength that arrogance always underestimates. It's a reminder that true power doesn't need to announce itself. If you enjoy stories where dignity triumphs over disdain, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We love hearing from you, so tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Now let's return to the dinner party that would change everything. The air in the Sterling dining room was heavy with the scent of roasted rosemary lamb and unspoken contempt. It was a vast room designed to intimidate, with a vaulted ceiling from which a crystal chandelier hung like a frozen waterfall. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the stern, ancestral portraits that lined the damask wallpapered walls. Every object in the room screamed old money, a carefully curated performance of generational wealth that had, in reality, run perilously thin. Leo sat with his back straight, his posture a quiet rebellion against the slouch of humiliation they intended for him. He watched his wife, Amelia, across the table. She was tracing the rim of her wineglass, her knuckles white. He could see the storm in her eyes, a tempest of familial loyalty and a wife's shame. She had promised him this dinner would be different. "They're trying, Leo," she had said, her voice a hopeful wisp of a thing. "Dad's had a tough quarter. He's just stressed." But it wasn't different. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, Sterling style. His father-in-law, Richard, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a mask of patrician disapproval, had just finished a long, rambling monologue about the importance of a proper legacy. The subtext, as always, was that Leo was a blemish on his. "It's not just about money, you see," Richard said, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. He didn't look at Leo, but the words were aimed at him like precisely thrown darts. "It's about what you build, what you leave behind, something tangible, something with your name on it." He gestured vaguely at the room, the house, the everything. "Our family has been in this community for a century. We have roots." Eleanor, his wife, a woman sculpted from ice and Chanel, added her own delicate touch. Amelia was raised to appreciate the finer things. It's in her blood. She's just not suited for a simple life. The word simple was delivered with the same distaste one might use for infested. Leo met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He had long ago perfected the art of the placid mask. Inside, he wasn't angry. He was an analyst, after all. He was observing, collecting data, running calculations. The data point he was currently processing was the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in Richard's hand as he lifted his glass. It was the look of a man bluffing with a terrible hand. "I believe in building things too, Richard," Leo said, his voice calm and even. It was this calmness that so infuriated them. It was like water on their fire. Instead of extinguishing it, it just created a frustrating, impotent steam. "But I believe the most important thing you can build is a life of integrity." Marcus, Amelia's brother, let out a short, derisive snort. Marcus was the family's princeling, a handsome, vapid man in his late 20s who wore his entitlement like a bespoke suit. He ran a tech startup that had absorbed a considerable amount of Richard's dwindling capital with no discernible product or profit. Integrity? Marcus scoffed, leaning forward. Is that what you call it? Working in some back-office cubicle, crunching numbers for other people's money? It's not exactly building an empire, is it, Leo? It pays the bills, Leo replied simply. Does it? Marcus pressed, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Does it really? I see the car you drive. I know the neighborhood you live in. It's fine for some people. But for Amelia? For a sterling? Amelia flinched. She looked from her brother to her father, a silent plea in her eyes. Stop. But Richard offered no quarter. He saw her discomfort not as a sign to relent, but as confirmation of his own views. He believed he was fighting for his daughter's rightful place in the world, a place she had foolishly abdicated by marrying this nobody. What Marcus means, Richard interjected, his voice a low growl of condescension, is that we worry about Amelia. We want to ensure she has the security she deserves. A man should be able to provide for his wife on a certain level. It's a matter of pride, of responsibility. Leo felt a familiar pang, not of anger, but of sorrow for his wife. She was trapped between two worlds, the one she was born into, with its suffocating expectations and hollow grandeur, and the one she had chosen with him, a world of genuine affection and quiet, unpretentious comfort. He knew she loved him, but the gravitational pull of her family was immense. Their approval was a drug she had been administered since birth, and its withdrawal was painful. He remembered their first meeting, 5 years ago, at a charity gala Richard had dragged her to. Leo was there not as a guest, but as an analyst for the philanthropic fund that was one of the event's major sponsors. He wasn't supposed to be there, but his boss had fallen ill, and Leo was the only one who had the data on the fund's performance memorized. He had been standing in a quiet corner, observing the calculated pageantry of the city's elite, when Amelia had approached him. She'd looked lost, a beautiful ship adrift in a sea of sharks. You look as miserable as I feel, she'd said, a wry smile gracing her lips. He'd been taken aback by her directness, her lack of artifice. Just running the numbers, he'd replied. The cost of the champagne versus the net donations. The ratio is inefficient. She had laughed, a real genuine laugh that cut through the polite murmur of the room. They talked for over an hour, about books and travel, and the absurdity of a life lived for appearances. He saw the person she was, separate from the sterling name. And she, he later learned, saw in him a stillness, a core of certainty that she found intoxicatingly safe. Her family had been appalled. When she first brought him to this very house for dinner, Richard had treated him like a specimen under a microscope. He had grilled Leo about his background, his education, his career path. Leo's honest, straightforward answers seemed only to deepen Richard's disdain. Leo worked for a small, boutique financial firm, Starkwater Analytics. Richard had never heard of it. Leo's parents were a retired teacher and a librarian. Good, honest people, but hardly titans of industry. He didn't belong to the right clubs, hadn't attended the right boarding school, didn't summer in the right places. He was, in Richard's eyes, an anchor threatening to drag his daughter down to the murky depths of the middle class. The years since had been a relentless campaign of attrition. 1,000 tiny cuts, the backhanded compliments, the helpful suggestions about his career, the lavish gifts they gave Amelia that they knew he could never match. Tonight felt different, though. The desperation that had been a faint undercurrent was now a palpable thrum in the air. Their insults lacked their usual lazy confidence. They were sharper, more pointed, laced with a fear that Leo could smell as clearly as the lamb on his plate. As the main course was cleared away by a silent, uniformed housekeeper, Leo felt a small, hard object in his pocket. He subtly pressed his fingers against the cool metal. It was a key, not to his own modest home, nor to his office. It was a master key, cut just this morning, that could open every single door in the house he was currently sitting in. He had debated bringing it, wondering if it was an act of petty theatrics, but he had decided it was a necessary symbol, a tangible piece of the truth he was about to lay on this mirror-polished table. It was his reminder that no matter what they said to him, no matter how small they tried to make him feel, he was the one sitting in the position of power. He was the foundation. They were just the ornate, crumbling facade. The conversation had lulled, a temporary ceasefire in the familial war. Eleanor was instructing the housekeeper on the proper way to serve the dessert wine, a performance for Leo's benefit. Richard stared into the middle distance, his thoughts clearly a world away, wrestling with demons Leo knew intimately. Marcus was scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the blue light, a bored prince in a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Leo looked at Amelia again. Her gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, he saw an apology. A flash of the woman who had laughed with him at the gala. Then it was gone, shuddered away as her mother began to speak again. "We were just talking with the Vanderbilts the other day," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with casual importance. "Their son, Charles, he just made partner at his law firm, 32 years old. Imagine, he's buying them a lovely summer home in the Hamptons. It's so wonderful when children can give back." The message was clear. Their son was a failure. Their son-in-law was a disgrace. Their daughter was a disappointment. It was a symphony of sterling grievance, and Leo was its sole audience. He took a slow sip of water, the cool liquid a balm in the heated room. He let the silence after Eleanor's pronouncement stretch, letting the weight of her words settle. He could feel their anticipation. They were waiting for him to bristle, to defend himself, to show a crack in his placid exterior. They needed him to react, to engage in their game on their terms. He refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, he turned his attention to his brother-in-law. "How is the new funding round going for your company, Marcus?" Leo asked, his tone one of genuine professional curiosity. Marcus looked up from his phone, startled. He was so used to being the one on the attack that a direct question about his own affairs seemed to catch him off guard. A flicker of panic crossed his face before it was replaced by his customary bravado. "It's going great," he said a little too quickly. "Absolutely crushing it. We have investors lining up. It's just a matter of finding the right strategic partners. We're being very selective." Leo nodded slowly, as if considering this. "Selective, that's a good strategy. You wouldn't want to get into bed with the wrong kind of money. It can create complications." Richard's head snapped toward Leo. The word complications seemed to land with physical force. For the first time all evening, Richard looked at Leo directly, a sharp, analytical glint in his eye. He was finally seeing not just his disappointing son-in-law, but a man who might know something. "What do you know about complications?" Richard asked, his voice low and dangerous. Leo held his gaze. The game was shifting. The long, slow burn was beginning to ignite. He hadn't planned to start the revelations this early, but Marcus and Richard had handed him the perfect opening. "I'm a financial analyst, Richard," Leo said, the words simple and true, yet now imbued with a new, unspoken weight. "It's my job to know about complications. I analyze risk. I follow the money. I see where it goes, and more importantly, where it stops going." He let that last phrase hang in the air. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just awkward or tense. It was heavy with the dread of the unknown. Eleanor looked confused, sensing the shift in tone, but not understanding its cause. Amelia looked from Leo to her father, her brow furrowed in worry. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the cocksure smirk gone from his face. The dessert, a decadent chocolate lava cake, arrived at that moment, the interruption both a relief and an intrusion. The housekeeper placed the plates with practiced care, oblivious to the invisible war now raging across the table. For a few moments, they all pretended to be interested in their food. But the pretense was thin. The chess match had begun, and Leo had just moved his queen. Richard, for all his bluster and arrogance, was not a stupid man. He had survived in the brutal world of high-stakes finance for 40 years. He knew the sound of a veiled threat when he heard one. He was looking at Leo now with a new, grudging respect. It was the look of a predator who has just realized the prey it was stalking might not be prey at all. This was the part of the evening Leo had been dreading and, in a strange way, anticipating. The humiliation was the price of admission. The silence from his wife was the wound he would have to tend to later. But this moment, this slow, dawning realization in their eyes that the world was not as they believed it to be, this was the beginning of the reckoning. And Leo, the quiet man from the back office cubicle, was about to become the auditor of their lives. The charade of dessert did not last long. Richard put his fork down with a sharp clink against the china plate. He had barely touched the cake. He folded his hands on the table, a gesture Leo recognized as his prelude to a serious business discussion. "All right, Leo," Richard said, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension. It was now flat, direct. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries. You're implying something. Say it plainly." Leo appreciated the directness. It was a language he was far more comfortable with than the passive-aggressive sniping that had preceded it. He looked at Amelia, a silent communication passing between them. "I'm sorry it has to be this way." He then turned his full attention back to her father. "Plainly?" Leo echoed. "All right. Plainly, Marcus's funding round isn't going well. It's not going at all. His seed investors have pulled their term sheets. His angel investors are getting cold feet. The word on the street is that his burn rate is unsustainable and his technology is vaporware." Marcus's face went white, then a blotchy, furious red. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You're nobody." "Where would you hear that garbage?" "As I said," Leo replied, his voice still infuriatingly calm, "I follow the money. The financial world is a very small town, Marcus, and your company has been ringing alarm bells for months. People talk." "They're lies," Marcus sputtered, looking to his father for support. "Dad, tell him. Tell him about the new deal." Richard didn't look at his son. His eyes were locked on Leo, a cold, hard stare of assessment. "The new deal," Richard said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The Argentis Group, a major infusion of capital. It's set to close next week." He said it as a statement, but it sounded like a question. He was testing Leo, trying to see the extent of his knowledge. Leo took a deliberate, slow sip of his wine before answering. He let the silence hang, a conductor holding a dramatic pause. "Argentis Group pulled out of the deal this morning at 10:45 a.m., Richard," Leo said softly. The statement landed in the center of the table and detonated. Simple, devastating, final. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Marcus looked as if he'd been physically struck, his mouth hanging open. Amelia stared at Leo, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. How could he possibly know that? Richard, however, did not flinch. His face became a granite mask, but Leo saw the truth in his eyes. The slight widening, the almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw. Leo had hit the bullseye. "How?" Richard whispered, the single word a confession of everything. "My firm, Starkwater Analytics," Leo began. "The one you've never heard of, the one you've dismissed as a back-office operation. We're not just analysts, Richard. We're one of the most respected opposition research and risk assessment firms in the country. When a major fund like Argentis Group considers a high-risk investment into a company with as many red flags as Marcus's, they hire a firm like mine to do a deep dive. A very, very deep dive." He paused, letting them absorb the first part of the revelation. His modest job was not so modest after all. He was a financial surgeon, the one called in to find the cancer before it could spread. My team was contracted by Argentis 3 weeks ago, Leo continued. We were tasked with a full forensic audit of Marcus's company, and by extension, your family's financial position, since you're his primary backer. We delivered our report to the Argentis board yesterday afternoon. The report was thorough. Marcus finally found his voice, a reedy, panicked thing. You did this? You sabotaged my deal? You son of a... I did my job, Marcus, Leo cut in, his voice hardening for the first time. My job was to present the facts. The fact is your company has no viable product. The fact is you've been misrepresenting your user engagement metrics by a factor of 10. The fact is you've been using new investor money to pay off old debts, a classic Ponzi scheme structure. The fact that Argentis decided not to invest $100 million into a fraudulent enterprise is not my fault. It's yours. Each fact was a hammer blow, dismantling the fragile edifice of Marcus's entire identity. He slumped back in his chair, defeated, the fight draining out of him. All eyes were now on Leo. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. He was no longer the lowly son-in-law to be pitied and scorned. He was the man who held all the cards. Eleanor was the first to break, her composure shattering like fine crystal. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, "what is he talking about? A Ponzi scheme? Is this true?" Richard wouldn't look at his wife. He was still staring at Leo, his mind racing, trying to calculate the new reality. "It was a bridge loan," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Creative financing." "It was fraud, Richard," Leo said, his voice devoid of judgment, stating it as a simple, observable reality. And Argentis wasn't just scared off by Marcus's books. They were scared off by yours. This was the second, more devastating blow. Richard's head came up, a flicker of his old, defiant pride in his eyes. "My books are impeccable." "Are they?" Leo countered softly. "Are they really? Or have you been leveraging every asset you have to its absolute limit? Taking out second and third mortgages? Borrowing against your stock portfolio? Propping up Marcus's fantasy at the expense of your own solvency?" Leo knew the answers. He had spent the last 3 weeks of his life swimming in the murky waters of the Sterling family's finances. He knew about the secret loans, the desperate calls to old friends who were no longer taking his calls, the slow, agonizing liquidation of a fortune that had been built over generations and squandered in less than one. "You have no right," Richard seethed, his voice low and venomous, "to pry into my private affairs, my family. When your private affairs become the collateral for a business deal my client is investigating, I have every right," Leo said. "My duty is to my client, and my reports showed that the Sterling family is on the verge of total financial collapse. You are bankrupt, Richard, in everything but name." The word hung in the opulent room, an obscenity. Bankrupt. Amelia made a small, wounded sound. She was looking at her father, her expression one of dawning horror. She had known they were having financial difficulties, but this was a catastrophe. It was at this moment that Richard's arrogance, his lifelong belief in his own superiority, finally and completely cracked. It was replaced by something Leo had never seen in the man before. Raw, unfiltered terror. The terror of a king who has just realized his castle is made of sand and the tide is coming in. "What do you want, Leo?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. It was the question of a defeated man. "Is this about revenge? You want to gloat? To see us ruined?" Leo leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. He looked at each of them in turn. At Marcus, hollowed out and broken. At Eleanor, her face a mask of disbelief and fear. At Richard, the fallen patriarch. Finally, he looked at his wife Amelia, whose tears were now silently tracing paths down her cheeks. "No, Richard," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a weariness that went beyond the evening's events. "I never wanted this. I take no joy in it. For 5 years I have sat at this table and endured your insults. I've listened to you belittle my work, my family, my character. I've watched you sow seeds of doubt in my wife's mind, trying to poison the one good thing in my life, and I have said nothing." He paused, gathering his thoughts. This was the list of grievances, the accounting he had promised himself he would one day deliver. "You judged me on the car I drive, not the integrity with which I live my life. You judged me on the size of my house, not the strength of my marriage. You judged me on a superficial, obscene metric of wealth that you yourselves could no longer live up to. You sneered at my simple life, all the while your own grand life was collapsing around you. The hypocrisy is staggering." He let his words sink in. There was no defense they could offer. He was holding up a moral mirror, and the reflection was hideous. "But this isn't about revenge," Leo repeated. "This is about consequences. And the consequences of your actions, of your pride and your deceit, are now at your door." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the key he had been touching all evening. He placed it gently on the polished mahogany table. It sat there, small and innocuous, yet it held more power than anything else in the room. Alongside it, he placed a folded set of documents from his inner pocket. "When a man is as over-leveraged as you are, Richard," Leo explained, his voice returning to the calm, analytical tone of a professional, "his debt becomes a commodity. It gets packaged and sold. Your debt, the multiple mortgages on this house, the lines of credit, the business loans, it was all bundled together by your primary lender and sold at a discount to an investment entity looking to acquire distressed assets." He pushed the key slightly forward. "I am that investment entity," Leo said. "Or rather, my private holding company is. I bought your debt 3 months ago. All of it." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The final, unimaginable truth. "When Marcus's Argentus deal fell through this morning," Leo continued, his voice as gentle as a surgeon's knife, "it triggered a covenant in your loan agreements, a default. As the sole debt holder, I had two options: force you into bankruptcy court or execute my right to seize the primary collateral used to secure the loans." He tapped the polished table with his finger. "This house, Richard, the foundation of your legacy, it became my property, free and clear, at 3:15 this afternoon. The deed was electronically transferred and filed with the county. I am the legal owner of the home you are currently sitting in." Silence. A profound, echoing silence that was louder than any shouting could ever be. The world had tilted on its axis. The man they had invited into their home to humiliate was not a guest. He was the landlord. He was the master of the house. Richard stared at the key. It was a simple object, but it represented the total and complete annihilation of his world. Everything he had built his identity upon, this house, his status, his power, was gone, and it had been taken by the one man he had never even considered a threat. Eleanor began to sob, not loudly, but with the quiet, desperate gasps of someone who has lost everything. Marcus just sat there, catatonic, staring into the abyss that had just opened up at his feet. But Leo was only watching Amelia. She hadn't moved. Her tears had stopped. She was looking at him, and for the first time, he felt she was truly seeing him. Not as a man her family disdained, not as the safe, simple husband she had chosen, but as the man he truly was, patient, strategic, and more powerful than she had ever imagined. The secrets he had kept were not to deceive her, but to protect her, to build a life for them on a foundation of reality, not illusion. "Leo," she whispered, her voice barely audible, Is this true?" He nodded slowly. "It's true, Amelia." The ensuing moments were a blur of raw, unfiltered emotion. Richard, his face purple with rage and disbelief, surged to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "You can't do this," he roared, his voice cracking. This is my home, my family's home for generations. It was, Leo corrected him, his tone still maddeningly level. It was your home until your debt exceeded your assets and you defaulted on your legal obligations. This isn't personal, Richard. It's just business. A concept I'm sure you understand. The use of Richard's own cold, dismissive language was a masterstroke of verbal irony. Leo was using the very weapons of the Sterling family against them, but without the cruelty. He was merely stating facts. "I'll sue you. I'll take you for everything you have," Richard threatened, his voice losing its power, devolving into a desperate bluster. At that moment, as if on cue, there was a firm, polite knock at the grand front door. Everyone froze. The sound, so normal, seemed utterly alien in the supercharged atmosphere of the dining room. The housekeeper, a woman who had served the Sterlings for 20 years with quiet invisibility, looked uncertainly toward Eleanor, who was still lost in a fog of shock. "I'll get it," Leo said, rising from his chair. The simple act of taking control, of assuming the role of the host in their own home, was another devastating blow. He walked out of the dining room, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. He returned a moment later, followed by a distinguished-looking man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase. The man had silver hair and a kind but firm expression. "Everyone," Leo said, "this is Mr. Davies. He's my attorney." Mr. Davies nodded politely to the stunned family. "Good evening. I apologize for the intrusion." His voice was calm and professional, a soothing balm on the raw nerves of the room, yet it carried an undeniable authority. Richard stared at the lawyer, his mind finally grasping the full, terrifying reality of his situation. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it had been planned with meticulous legal precision. "Mr. Davies has the official paperwork," Leo explained, gesturing to the briefcase. "The new deed, the notice of transfer of ownership, and the eviction notice." The words eviction notice finally broke through Eleanor's shock. "Eviction?" she cried, her voice rising in hysteria. "You can't be serious. You would throw us out onto the street? Amelia, he would throw your own mother out onto the street." She turned her desperate, tear-streaked face to her daughter, appealing to the bond of blood, the last card she had left to play. "Amelia, darling, you can't let him do this. Talk to him. He's your husband. You must have some influence over him." This was the moment of truth for Amelia, the crucible. For 5 years she had stood silently by, a passive observer to her family's casual cruelty. She had tried to mediate, to keep the peace, to exist in the liminal space between the man she loved and the family she was born to. But that space no longer existed. Leo had just razed it to the ground. She had to choose a side. She slowly rose from her chair, her movements graceful but deliberate. She did not look at her mother. She did not look at her father or her brother. She looked only at Leo. Her eyes searched his, looking for the man she had married. Was he a cold, vengeful predator who had been playing a long game of revenge? Or was he the same kind, patient man who had held her when she cried, who listened to her fears, who had loved her without condition? In his eyes she saw no triumph, no gloating. She saw only a deep, profound sadness and a quiet strength that was waiting for her. He was not asking her to choose him over them. He was asking her to choose a future over a past, to choose truth over illusion. "Mother," Amelia said, her voice surprisingly steady, "for years I have watched you and Dad and Marcus treat my husband with nothing but contempt. You have never respected him. You have never respected my choice. You have never respected me." She turned to face her family, her spine straight and her gaze clear. It was as if a veil had been lifted. She was no longer the dutiful daughter, but a woman in her own right. "You talk about this house, this legacy," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But what is it? It's just a building, a collection of things. You cared more about these walls than you did about my happiness. You were willing to sacrifice my marriage for your pride." She looked at her brother. "You mocked him for his job, Marcus, while he was quietly building a real fortune through skill and hard work. You built a fantasy on Dad's money, and you were willing to let it all burn down, taking everyone with you." Then she faced her father. "And you, Dad. You accused Leo of not being able to provide for me. But you were the one who couldn't provide. You provided a life of lies, of debt, of keeping up appearances while everything was rotting from the inside. Leo built us a real life, a secure life. You almost destroyed it." The words were a judgment, more powerful than any legal document. It was the verdict of a daughter who had finally seen the truth. Richard staggered back, as if she had physically pushed him. The condemnation from his own child was the blow from which he would not recover. Amelia walked around the table until she was standing beside Leo. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration, an alliance, a marriage, finally, of two people standing together against the world. She looked at her family, her heart aching with a mixture of love and pity and righteous anger. "Leo is my husband. He is my family. This," she said, squeezing his hand, "is my home now, wherever he is." Mr. Davies, who had been watching the family drama with a practiced, neutral expression, cleared his throat softly. "If I may," he said, opening his briefcase, "my client does not wish to be unnecessarily cruel. The notice gives you 30 days to vacate the premises. Mr. Miller has also authorized me to offer you assistance in securing a new, more modest residence. He is willing to cover the first 6 months' rent on a suitable apartment." The offer of mercy was, in its own way, the most humiliating thing of all. They were being offered charity by the man they had scorned. It was a complete and utter reversal of fortune. Richard Sterling, the proud patriarch, the man of stone in history, finally broke. He sank into his chair, his head in his hands, a broken man at his own dining table. Eleanor's sobs became ragged and uncontrolled. Marcus just stared blankly, the architect of his own ruin. Leo looked at the scene of devastation he had wrought. He felt no pleasure, only a grim sense of necessity. The cancer had been cut out. The healing would be long and painful, but it could now, finally, begin. He put his arm around Amelia, pulling her close. "Let's go home," he said softly. And for the first time, as they walked out of the grand, echoing hall, leaving the wreckage of the Sterling dynasty behind them, Amelia understood what home really meant. It wasn't a place, it was a person. It was the quiet, underestimated man who had just saved her from a legacy of lies. The days that followed were a study in quiet efficiency. Leo and Amelia stayed in a hotel suite while Mr. Davies' team managed the transition. The Sterlings, shell-shocked and rudderless, moved like ghosts through the grand house that was no longer theirs. There were no more arguments, no more threats. The fight had gone out of them, replaced by a stunned, bewildered compliance. Leo had instructed his lawyer to be as accommodating as possible. He arranged for movers. He had real estate agents send Eleanor a curated list of tasteful, if significantly smaller, apartments in a respectable, though not prestigious, part of the city. He was dismantling their lives with the same precision and lack of malice with which he analyzed a stock portfolio. This wasn't punishment, it was a market correction. Amelia acted as the reluctant liaison. The phone calls with her mother were difficult, filled with long, weeping silences and occasional, desperate accusations. But Amelia held firm. Her loyalty, once so tragically divided, was now a singular, unshakable thing. She was with Leo. She had chosen her future. "She doesn't understand," Amelia told Leo one evening, as they sat on the balcony of their hotel room overlooking the city lights. "She keeps asking me how you could be so cruel. I try to explain that this isn't about cruelty, it's about truth. But they've lived with the lies for so long, the truth just feels like an attack. They'll adjust, Leo said, taking her hand. Or they won't, but that's their choice. We can't live their lives for them. He had been remarkably gentle throughout the process. He never once said, "I told you so." He never reveled in his victory. He simply held her, provided a calm center in her emotional storm, and handled the logistics of their new life. It was in these quiet moments that Amelia fell in love with him all over again, not for the power he had hidden, but for the grace with which he now wielded it. The day the Sterlings were scheduled to move out, Leo and Amelia went to the house one last time to oversee the final handover. It was a surreal experience. The grand rooms, once so intimidating, were now filled with boxes and packing paper. The ancestral portraits had been taken down, leaving pale, ghostly rectangles on the wallpaper. The house was being stripped of its identity, waiting for a new one. They found the family in the living room, sitting amongst the detritus of their former lives. Richard looked 10 years older, the arrogant glint in his eye replaced by a weary resignation. Eleanor's face was puffy from crying, her Chanel suit looking out of place in the disarray. Marcus was slumped on a packing crate, staring at his phone, though he didn't seem to be reading it. The silence was thick and uncomfortable. It was Richard who spoke first, his voice raspy. "The movers will be done by 5, he said, not looking at Leo. "We'll leave the keys on the kitchen counter." "Thank you, Richard," Leo said simply. There was nothing else to say. Eleanor, however, could not let it go so easily. "I hope you're happy, Leo," she said, her voice dripping with a final, weak attempt at venom. "I hope you enjoy this house, filled with the memories you've destroyed." Before Leo could respond, Amelia stepped forward. "The only thing he destroyed were the lies, Mother," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "He's giving us a chance to build something real. You should try to do the same." She then did something that surprised everyone, including Leo. She went to her mother and hugged her. Eleanor was stiff at first, but then she seemed to collapse into the embrace, her body shaking with silent sobs. Amelia held her for a long moment, a daughter comforting a mother who had suddenly become as fragile as a child. She then went to her father. She kissed him on the cheek. "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered. He didn't respond, but she saw a single tear trace a path down his weathered face. She ignored Marcus. His betrayal, in some ways, felt the most personal. He was of her generation, and his petty jealousy had been the sharpest knife. Then she took Leo's hand and led him out the door, without a backward glance. 3 months later, the house was transformed. The dark, heavy furniture of the Sterlings was gone, replaced by a clean, modern aesthetic that was light and airy. The severe ancestral portraits were replaced with vibrant modern art that Amelia had always loved but had never been allowed to display. The house, once a museum of a dead past, was slowly becoming a home. Leo and Amelia had found a new rhythm, a new partnership. The secret that had once stood between them was now the foundation of their new, honest life. Amelia, freed from the weight of her family's expectations, seemed to blossom. She had enrolled in a landscape design course, a passion she had long suppressed. She spent her days planning the gardens, sketching out flower beds and pathways. She was creating life and beauty where there had once been only sterile formality. Leo, for his part, continued his work at Starkwater, but he made a change. He started leaving the office at 5 o'clock. He learned to disconnect. He had spent so many years quietly, diligently building his fortune, preparing for a future he wasn't sure he would ever get to enjoy. Now he was finally living in it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Leo was in his new home office, the room that had once been Richard's imposing, mahogany-paneled study, when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Hello? Leo? It's Marcus." Leo was surprised. He hadn't heard from his brother-in-law since that fateful dinner. Marcus, to what do I owe the pleasure? Marcus's voice was hesitant, stripped of its old arrogance. Look, I know I have no right to ask you for anything, and I'm not. I wanted to say, you were right. The confession seemed to cost him a great deal. You were right about everything, Marcus continued. My company was a joke. I was a joke. I was just playing a part I thought my dad wanted me to play. What are you doing now, Marcus? Leo asked, his curiosity piqued. I got a job, Marcus said, a note of wonder in his voice. A real one. I'm a junior sales associate at a software company. It's entry level. The pay is terrible. I have to fetch coffee for people younger than me. He paused. And I've never been happier. Leo was silent for a moment, processing this. I'm learning things, Marcus went on, the words tumbling out now. Real things, how a business actually works, how to talk to clients. I'm not a CEO. I'm just a guy in a cubicle trying to make his quota. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm actually building something real, even if it's small. It was a stunning admission. The humiliation had been a fire that had burned away his false pride, leaving something authentic in its place. I'm glad to hear that, Marcus, Leo said, and he meant it. I wish you the best. Yeah, me too, Marcus said. And Leo, I'm sorry for everything. He hung up before Leo could reply. Leo sat there for a long time, staring out the window at the autumn leaves falling on the lawn. Redemption, it seemed, was possible, but it had to be earned. The Sterlings did not fade away. They found a 3-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. Richard, stripped of his empire, was forced into a retirement he was unprepared for. For months he was bitter and withdrawn. But slowly, with nothing left to pretend to, he began to change. He started taking long walks. He joined a book club at the local library, a place he would have sneered at a year ago. He started talking to Eleanor again, not about finances and status, but about their day, about the book he was reading, about the couple they met at the park. They were rebuilding their own foundation, one small, honest brick at a time. Amelia fostered a tentative relationship with them. They met for coffee once a week in a neutral cafe, halfway between their two homes. The conversations were stilted at first, but gradually they found a new way of being with each other, one that wasn't based on the old power dynamics. They were just parents and a daughter, navigating a new, unmapped territory. One evening, about a year after the dinner, Leo and Amelia were sitting by the fireplace in what was now their living room. A fire crackled, casting a warm glow on their faces. Amelia was curled up against him, reading a book on garden design. Marcus called me today, she said, not looking up from her book. He made his first big sale. He was so proud. I know, Leo said. He called me too. She looked up at him, a soft smile on her face. You know, in a strange way, you saved them. I didn't do anything, Amelia, he said. Reality did. I just delivered the audit. No, she insisted, closing her book and turning to face him fully. You did more than that. You could have destroyed them. You could have been vengeful and cruel. You could have thrown them out with nothing. But you didn't. You were principled. You were fair. You showed them a mercy they never would have shown you. She reached up and touched his face. That's the man I married. Not the man who owns this house, but the man who knew what to do with it. Leo leaned in and kissed her, a kiss filled with the quiet comfort of a shared life, built not on stone or paper, but on a foundation of mutual respect and hard-won truth. He had faced down their arrogance, not with arrogance of his own, but with integrity. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered. True worth is not in what you own or the name you carry, but in the content of your character. It is a quiet strength, a patient dignity, and the courage to stand for the truth, even when you are standing alone. The Sterlings had to lose everything to learn that lesson. Leo had known it all along. This story is a powerful reminder that respect is earned, not inherited, and that true strength often lies in the quietest corners. What do you think? Was Leo justified in his actions, or did he go too far? We would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective helps our community grow. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more content that explores the complexities of human relationships and the triumph of integrity. Thank you for being with us today, and we'll see you in the next story.